Hi, everyone. My name is Jeanette Werman. I'm just coming to the end of a course on psychedelic assisted therapy. And in the course of doing holotropic breath work, meditation, and psychedelics, I've had some Kundalini experiences. So I wanted to look at psychedelics as Kundalini activators, which is something Claudio Naranjo suggests using Jungian psychology. So it seems like we in the West don't really have a cultural or spiritual tradition within which to understand Kundalini when it comes up. So people can end up feeling quite confused and distressed by their experiences. So I wanted to share this with you and ask you to think about, has your Kundalini been triggered by the use of psychedelics? Were you told that this might happen as you prepare for your medicine journey? And do you think people generally are sufficiently aware of the possibility that Kundalini might come up while they're using psychedelics? And if not, do you think that that matters? And as a second thing, and I'd love feedback on that. So if you want to put stuff in the chat or whatever. Um, and in addition to that, do you think it would be good? The Kundalini Collective have got an amazing website where you can log your own experiences with Kundalini. So that's building up a record of people's experiencing. But would it also be good to edit a book collecting short accounts of people's journeys with Kundalini? Because not everyone sort of accesses websites and so on. Thanks. Okay, so and I must apologize for this face that keeps coming up. I'll try and remove it, but I don't know if I'll be able to. This cameo. So Claudio Naranjo says that psychedelics are Kundalini activators. So uh, non-ordinary states of consciousness, when you go into them, that you can access deep dynamic layers of the psyche, and psychedelics help us to enter those states, and Kundalini energy can also give rise to them. Um, and of course, psychedelics can trigger Kundalini. So these experiences can be quite chaotic and intense. And the question is, how safe is it? Is there a risk of unleashing overwhelming powers in the psyche? I mean, I was afraid of that for myself. So I wondered how we can contain this material for ourselves as participants, or for our clients if we're practitioners. So there are different ways to understand these experiences, different narratives or theories um, offer different lenses through which we can view the experience. And how you understand something can influence the way you experience it. It's a bit like climbing a mountain from different sides. You get a different perspective on it. Um, I personally think the various lenses may point to the same underlying, maybe ineffable human experiences, which in the metaphor would be the mountain's core. So the aim of my project, in a way, it was a journey of my own integration, making sense of the experiences I'd had. Is I wanted to understand those core experiences to be able to form a view on the safety of entering non-ordinary states. Um, and I found you can't really translate directly between the theories. So I decided to look at experiences which have a numinous quality, in the hope that they could offer potential points of resonance between the narratives, where intuitively you had a sense that they were talking about the same thing, maybe using different concepts and different ways of putting it. So you can, for instance, have a sense of the numinous as you experience a complex, which is, we'll come back to what that is. And and Kundalini energy, which can have quite a bodily experience, a visceral quality. So I looked at what the different narratives or theories say about complexes and Kundalini, and then I also looked at my own experiences to see if I could find a resonance there. So just to remind ourselves what complexes and archetypes are. So Carl Jung talks about these things. He says archetypes are a priori, which means they're there in the beginning, they're foundational, universal formative principles in the collective psyche, a bit like instincts. And we can only know them by how they structure the way we encounter the world. They have a deeply meaningful, awesome, numinous quality. Complexes, he says, are more or less unconscious clusters of associated psychic content. So that's memories, associations, fantasies, expectations, behavior, and so on. And these group around a core element with a strong emotional charge. They have an archetypal core, and they draw in material from both the personal and the collective psyche in line with archetypal patterning. And they're more or less autonomous, so they develop a life of their own, and we register them in an embodied as well as a mental way. And Chris Beisch has given a really good way of picturing it. Maybe we can think of it as a seed experience, which is this strong feeling, maybe a trauma, which is dropped into a solution of consciousness, and the complex crystallizes out around it using elements that fit from the solution, and the crystalline structure of it would then be the archetypal patterning. So the accounts of the Kundalini fit within the notion of a subtle energy system, which is a complementary model of the body-mind system to that of Western medicine. It involves a range of different energetic systems, including meridians, which are energy channels, and chakras, which are organ-like energy centers. So Kundalini really is our life force. It's an archetypal force of transformation, and it flows through the subtle energy system. You'll have heard of the metaphor of a coiled snake at the bottom of our spine. When it becomes more activated, it rises through our core, energizing the chakras and opening us up to subtle levels of awareness. So my experience, and it really begs the question of whether it really is Kundalini, has been of intense, challenging energetic states, which are also ecstatic and deeply satisfying. And they can involve inward shaking, a sense of energy streaming or radiating, involuntary physical movements, changes in breathing, powerful emotional and dreamlike inner processes, and emotional release. So I asked, is there a resonance between the narratives as they describe the numinous aspect of our experiences of complexes and Kundalini energy? And can we talk of a Kundalini complex on the interface between the narratives? And can we understand Kundalini activation as an expression of the inner healing tendency? So I looked at some psychodynamic theories and some writings on Kundalini and some of the theories on energy and consciousness. And then a couple of days before I presented this talk to the Institute, I came across Dana Swain's dissertation, which is called Revisioning Kundalini, Exploring Experiences with Kundalini from a Jungian and Archetypal Perspective, which was really encouraging because I think she's thinking along similar lines to myself. So I came away with some key ideas from this reading. One is that our psyche lies on a continuum with, on the one end, a personal conscious pole, and at the other end, a collective unconscious one. And the collective unconscious, which is something Carl Jung writes about, is an impersonal layer of the psyche, and it underpins and influences our individual consciousness, and the archetypes lie on that sort of level in that field. And there is also an intermediate mythopoetic field, which is something Donald Culchert writes about, where these two realms, if you like, shade into each other. So it's the middle of the continuum, if you like. What a lot of people have written about is how trauma, when we experience something that is so unbearable that we can't contain it in our awareness, elements of our experience get split off from awareness, and these can take form in that intermediate field, and complexes is an example of that. They can form these complexes, and psychic defenses, our inner defenses, then stop us from recovering such experiences. Kalsha talks about the self-care system, and he describes something that he calls protector and persecutor figures. So complexes can form that both protect us from experiencing something that was so overwhelming that we couldn't integrate it, and our psyche would just have fragmented if we hadn't had this self-care system. But they can become overly restrictive because they're defending us, but it means that we become too rigid, and we can't have access to our full range of experiences, our feelings, and also sometimes we end up being triggered by things that we come across in our external lives, and we respond partly on the basis of our past experience rather than our present being in the current situation. So Kundalini, which is also called Shakti, is an autonomous, self-directed archetypal process, and it's an experience of embodied psycho-spiritual transformation, a subtle, non-physical, universal creative force, and an energetic presence of consciousness that permeates everything. And as the energy, this Kundalini, moves through and clears blocks, it can trigger intense emotional, psychosomatic, and spiritual experiences. It also increases awareness of the subtle dimension of embodied experience. Non-ordinary states can activate Kundalini because it relaxes. They relax the ego control, our normal sort of rational ego control that we have over what we can experience, and our body armor, which reflect the way we hold it, the tensions in our body reflect or mirror our character structure and ego control. So Jung says the Eastern Kundalini process parallels what he calls the individuation process in the West. So he describes a way that people mature over the course of the lifespan, which he calls the individuation process. And he says Kundalini, the process of Kundalini parallels that. Both decentralize the ego so that it becomes less important, and we become less identified with thoughts and emotions, and can see our life more objectively. From my reading, again, I'm not an expert on any of this, around energy and consciousness. Quantum field theory suggests that there is one integrated, interconnected, universal field of consciousness and relationships, which seems to be very similar to Jung's collective unconscious and the teachings from ancient wisdom traditions. David Bohm suggests that everything has two aspects: an explicit, physical and observable one, which is embedded in an implicate, non-physical one. And it involves a non-local consciousness, which is primary. So consciousness exists before all else, and matter is a reflection of or a material form that comes out of, evolves out of that, or arises out of that, and is sustained by that. Evolution in this view is an increase in coherence, complexity, and awareness. So to come back to my questions, is there a resonance between the narratives as they describe the numinous aspect of our experiences of complexes and Kundalini energy? Might there be a Kundalini complex? And is activation of Kundalini energy another way of understanding the inner healing tendency? So with respect to that first question, Chris Beisch quite rightly pointed out that Kundalini energy and complexes are fundamentally different things. So a complex is a temporary psychophysical memory construct which can be healed or dissolved. Its elements can be reabsorbed into the psyche so that it loses its power. But Kundalini, as we saw, is a flow of subtle life energy that saturates our body-mind system. So you can't dissolve it. You can't make it go away or reabsorb it. Chris also said complexes are not inherently numinous, but Kundalini can activate them. And as it energizes the chakras, it exposes and engages the complexes lodged there, and that's what gives the sense of the numinous. So that's ecstatic energies, insights, and experiences. So even if that's true, even if complexes are lit up by Kundalini energy, and I think, I'm not saying that it isn't true, I think that is the way it works. I wondered, could the resultant experience of the numinous not still offer a point of resonance between the narratives as they try to describe it? And could, triggered by the experience of Kundalini and drawing on personal and cultural material, which is patterned by this energy, could a Kundalini complex not still form? So as a separate thing to the Kundalini energy, could there also be a Kundalini complex? Jung spoke of an Eastern and a Western psyche, depending on how central the thinking saw the ego as being. And so maybe an Eastern form of a Kundalini complex is becoming more accessible to us in the West because we're exposed to Eastern spirituality and practice. And maybe we're now attaching our own unconscious personal and collective content to it, so that a new Western form of the complex is emerging. And if that's true, then this new complex might explain why increasingly people are having Kundalini experiences. It might make it easier for us to experience that subtle Kundalini energy. So, is Kundalini activation a way of experiencing the inner healing tendency, which is a term that people like Stan Groff use? All these narratives about our inner experience suggest some form of intrinsic, autonomous, evolutionary, self-healing or self-regulating tendency. And it's that tendency that can get blocked. And then healing involves the release of those blocks. And Kundalini may be the driver behind that process of kind of opening us up and allowing the energy to flow. And for that to happen, you need to, as much as possible, let go of ego control and surrender to the process. So when I looked at my own experiences, I thought the theory did seem to be borne out. I could see complexes going back to early developmental circumstances and split off aspects of those experiences which have created these kind of protector, um, persecutor figures in my intermediate field, forms with quite an archetypal charge behind them. And it seems to fit with my defenses and character structure. So the challenging themes that came up during my non-ordinary states of consciousness or experiences thereof um, were could well be expressions of those protector persecutor figures and or memory traces of early experiences. So as non-ordinary states allow Kundalini to move through the chakras, that does seem to bring out complexes for integration. So we usually talk about integration in terms of a process, it being a process of making unconscious material conscious and finding a meaningful narrative for it. How can we make sense of our experience, which is a largely mental understanding of the process. So I'm wondering whether maybe the experience of Kundalini as it activates the complexes is actually a corresponding non-conceptual embodied experience. So then integration could be the mental side of a coin of which experience of Kundalini is the non-conceptual or embodied side. And of course, since Kundalini is a universal, vital, evolutionary force, we all have it. It's active in all of us, whether we register it or not. And maybe the reason we don't always feel it or not everybody feels it is that we're more or less defended, distracted, or tuned in to registering the experience. And you read about people sitting for years to experience Kundalini. And I certainly don't fall in that category. I'm not an experienced practitioner. But I wondered whether maybe breath work and psychedelics, because they're such powerful techniques, allow us to drop into a layer of the psyche where the ego is less relevant, so that we then, if you like, experience the energy incidentally by accident. And once having been there, maybe we can then go back there more easily. Maybe, new neural pathways are formed or whatever, but maybe we get back there. We will remember how to get back there. So just coming back to the question of how safe entry into non-ordinary states of consciousness is, psychedelics are Kundalini activators. So you can feel like you're in a riptide, drawing you into a field of archetypal gravitational pull. And we do need that Dionysian intense call to journey and surrender, but it may take us out faster and further than we're able to hold or integrate. And we may need our defenses. The experience of inner wounding infused with archetypal energy might re-traumatize us. And that could intensify our symptoms and bolster our defenses. Because psychedelics are an external trigger for loosening our defenses, that may also make managing the opening more difficult, and temporarily dissolving our ego structures, for some of us, may leave our egos weakened with too much archetypal penetrance. That's a term that Tim Reed used to describe the way that archetypal energies can, for some people, flood into their everyday awareness, so that the kind of boundary between the unconscious and the conscious has got too loose, the threshold. So it floods into everyday awareness. So that can trigger what's called a spiritual emergency. And maybe you can even have too much God, as Chris Beige suggests. So we need to balance the potential gains of a Dionysian surrender with structures to maximize the safety and minimize harm. So that that's around set and setting of working with non-ordinary states of consciousness, in particular psychedelics, I suppose, in the context of this talk, and good preparation and integration of the journey that you have. So just to conclude, I think we can think of Kundalini activation as an expression of the inner healing tendency. And Kundalini energy, if it's archetypal, which I think it is, maybe a Kundalini complex can form in alignment to it. The notion of a Kundalini complex could be really useful because it bridges different narratives so that it makes experiences less frightening. It's easier to understand what we're going through. And maybe the mental forms of integration and the embodied experience of Kundalini are two sides of the same coin. And maybe it is the experience of the numinous as the complexes are activated that actually makes non-ordinary states so healing. So we need both the courage of surrender to have those experiences, but also containing practices to minimize the risk of harm, a good set and setting. We need to find ways of managing what could otherwise be overwhelming experiences. So just to remind you of the questions, I hope you will, I'd love feedback anyway on the presentation. What do you think of the ideas in it? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Does it make sense? Is it confusing? But also, if you wanted to write about, has your Kundalini been triggered by the use of psychedelics? And how was that for you? And were you told that that might happen as you prepared for your medicine journey? I guess not everybody will have done a formal preparation for their journey. Sometimes they're just done in the course of other things like being at a party or whatever. But if you did do a planned psychedelic journey in the preparation, did anyone mention the possibility of Kundalini coming up? Do you think generally people are well enough prepared for the possibility that Kundalini might be triggered by psychedelics or holotropic breath work or meditation, mindfulness? And if not, do you think that matters? Maybe it's okay to leave it like that. And then as a separate thing, do you think it would be a good idea to edit a book to collect short accounts of people's journeys with Kundalini? How it started with them, how it developed, what was difficult, what was beautiful about it, what did they learn from it, if anything, where are they with it now? Just short accounts, maybe 1,500 words, so that we can collect many of them in a little booklet. In addition to the wonderful website that the Kundalini Collective have, where anyone can log their experiences with Kundalini and ask for support with it if that's what they need. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening and watching. I'll just do 2 more slides with some of the books that I read in case it's helpful and you might want to have a look at it. Thanks very much. Bye. I realize I can't make my head go away, but hopefully you can still see that book. The last book here is not very clear. So it's Winnicott, Donald Winnicott, Playing in Reality. Okay. Bye, everyone.